All right, everyone, thank you very much, and I'm going to just start because we are already running late. Welcome to this session, and thank you for being so patient with us. This is the third panel of the day, and it's an extremely significant panel as we're going to be talking about the Me Too movement, social media, and evolving redressal measures, and it's going to be followed by an open discussion. We have three panelists with us for this session. We have Vaishnavi Suresh, she's a documentary photographer and a campaigner working primarily on gender issues and climate change. We're very happy to have you here, Vaishnavi. We have Mr. Oishik Sarkar from Jindal School of Law, and we have Professor Rahul Jairam from Jindal School of Liberal Arts and Humanities. I do not want to take up much time as a moderator. Each panelist will have around 15 to 20 minutes, and I'll give you a heads up when 5 minutes are left. The session, I believe, will be throwing up certain interesting questions around the Me Too movement. The brief that the panel, the organizers have given me, it talks about the tussle between due process and the structural bias of the legal system that the Me Too movement has thrown up. There are significant questions that the Me Too movement has raised about the context in which Me Too has emerged, the fact that there have been similar mobilizations around the world, like Me Too. For example, the hashtag Me Uno Menos in Argentina, the hashtag First Time I Got Harassed, that got started in Egypt, hashtag With You, which was in Japan. So there have been similar mobilizations across the world, like the Me Too. And it throws up important questions about why Me Too, what are the contestations within the Me Too movement, and from Me Too where. Now that we know that Me Too has happened and similar mobilizations have happened across the world, where do we see ourselves going forward? So having said that, over to the panelists. We will follow the same sort of order that is there in the program. So Vaishnavi, may I request you to go first, and I will give you a heads up when there are 5 minutes left. You have around 20.
Hi, I'm Vaishnavi. I reached Jindal last night, and I've just been walking around a little, and everyone looks at me like, why is 11 from Stranger Things walking around like this? So I'm going to start off with some frequently asked questions. Frequent questions that I get asked. So yeah, the first one is, am I a bald 12-year-old with telepathic powers? No, I wish I was. So who am I? I'm Vaishnavi Suresh. I'm primarily a documentary photographer. I studied in Symbiosis, and that's my biggest life regret. I'm now working as a campaigner with this organization called Jatka in Bangalore. They're amazing. If you don't know what they are, look them up. They didn't pay me to say this. Why am I relevant to this panel? Honestly, I don't know. I'm so underqualified to be here. I think a bunch of people from Jindal follow me on Instagram and think I'm cool. And now that you've seen me, I hope you know the farce is off. But I did do something. So this started in October when the Me Too movement hit India last year. And alumni from my college started getting called out, which led to professors from my college getting called out. And this one day when it just got too much, I had a lot of beer because that's how adults deal with life healthily. And I just got home and I was like, you know what, I should probably do something about it. So I went to Instagram because that's what we do these days. And I put up a bunch of stories. And this is the first one. I basically reached out to, actually a bunch of my juniors, classmates, seniors had reached out to me saying, they were, okay, so before I start, I will be talking about things that pertain to sexual abuse and harassment, so if that is triggering to any of you, I think you might have to leave the room and I can talk to you once we're done. Should I wait? Is everyone okay? Okay, I'm going to take that as yes. So a bunch of my juniors and classmates had reached out to me saying they'd been sexually abused by either some of our professors or some of the classmates, and then now it was all out in the open, and I decided since I'm a campaigner, I should probably do something about this. So I went on to Instagram and I asked people if they'd be on board to, probably reach out to college and see how we can fix this issue, which is so enormous. I drafted a petition of sorts with 8 demands. So at that point, Symbiosis was so bad that we've been around for 10 years, but about 70 students had been called out, which was an average of 7 male students per batch, and 2 professors. So the situation was so bad that none of us knew what an ICC was. There was an ICC on paper, but none of us knew about it. So the demands basically asked for an ICC to be formed and let us know about it, for the professors to be suspended until further investigation happens, for an anonymous complaint portal and redressal measures. And that a lot of people seem to agree with that. So the petition got about 300 signatures, which might not seem like a lot, but Symbiosis so far has had only 1,500 students in the whole of 10 years. So this is about more than about 20% of its entire student population. And then it got big on the news. Since we were a media organization, people were very happy to write about us. And it got big on the news. So at one point I was dealing with people who were talking to me about how they were being abused. I was talking to college about why they were so shitty. And then I was talking to media about why they were so shitty. And it was just hectic. But ultimately, I think it turned out well, because last month the 2 professors who were accused of sexual abuse initially they were suspended, now they've been fired. My director, who was very inactive about all of these issues, was suspended for 4 months, and now he's back in an admin role. We have a new director who is apparently great, like the new kids love him, and he suspended the dress code, so obviously they love him. And yeah, so I guess that is sort of a happy ending. So since obviously I didn't do this alone, I did it with a lot of people, but since I sort of led it, I guess, yeah, that's why I'm relevant to this panel. This is something that I got asked a lot, and I'm sure all of us have seen this happen on social media, where people are just like, oh, it really happened, why didn't they go to the cops, bro? I'm sorry, am I allowed to do this?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm not from an academic background, so I have no decency. So I feel like all of us know why women, or worse, men, or just anyone doesn't want to go to the cops when they're sexually abused, because they've heard it's not been a great experience. Now it comes to why they don't go to college officials. Some of us did, and so this was one of the petitions that we started to ask my director to be removed from the job. So a part of that, I'm just going to read this out for people who can't see it. It says, 2 faculty members, Mr. Suhas Gatne and Mr. Vijay Shalal, have been accused of sexual misconduct on campus. Though these incidents have come up in the light of Me Too, we have testimonials of students who agreed to have complained to Anupam Siddhartha, who was my director, about these professors many years ago. In one testimonial, a student recounts that Anupam Siddhartha had dismissed the female student's complaints against Mr. Shalal by saying, when have you ever acted like a girl to deserve to be treated as one? So basically, when this girl finally did go to the officials to complain, my director just dismissed her off by saying she never acted like a girl, so there's no way she could have been sexually abused. So yeah, that's sort of why we don't go to the officials or the cops, because actually this is one of the kinder things he has said to people. Another thing I get asked often is, bro, these feminazis will say Me Too for everything. What about the guy's life that gets ruined? So yeah, this is I'm just going to show you some things of how guys' lives have been ruined after being called out for sexual abuse. There's this. And then there's this, which says Sawant, Gaurav Sawant, who's accused. continues to be the lead anchor of India First segment on India Today. This is Vinod Dua, who was back in HW News. This is MJ Akbar, who was back in Hindustan Times. So yeah, a minute of silence for all the ruined lives of men. How can the ICCs bridge the gap between legal system and what is happening in the digital space? So, when the thing in my college got blown out, they constituted an ICC, which was filled with Anupam Siddhartha, the director, who proudly told us that he buried the sexual harassment cases that happened in Symbiosis Bangalore. And then another person who was on the committee was Snehal Garande, a professor who didn't care about one of our students getting sexually abused because she was late to class. And Kavita Iyer, who one of our alumni passed away in a railway accident, and she saw it and her reaction was, oh my god, this is such bad PR for our college. So when you have people like this in your ICC, I would much rather go to Instagram to talk about what happened to me than go to any of them. And not just that, like, okay, so last night and this morning, I also heard that Mr. Sudarshan, who opened this panel, has been very inappropriate with women in his college. So in a conference like this, where we are dealing with sexual abuse and how we can, make campuses safer for women, if we have people like Mr. Sudarshan open, then I'm just going to go to Instagram or Facebook to talk about my problem, then come to anyone in college. So yeah, so make the places safer, don't have people like these on your ICC or in conferences, and then maybe we will think of going to the officials and not social media. So yeah, that's me. I will take questions in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oshik, may I request you, this is Rahul. Rahul, may I request you to go next, please?
Since we've got only 15 minutes or so, I'll try
20.
20. I'll keep this as short, direct and specific as possible. Now, I've been teaching at Jindal University for 5.5 years, and before I came here, I was a full-time journalist. And although this panel has got some sort of legalistic focus, I'm not going to be talking about law as such, and I'm going to be talking about this in terms of my response to it as a journalist. I still do a fair amount of freelance journalism, and as someone who's been writing journalistic op-eds and essays on different kinds of things. Now, the first thing that struck me about Me Too, both Me Too America and Me Too India, these are the two big Me Too movements I've been following, and of course many of the Me Too movements which have been taking place elsewhere. But to a good extent, these are the two movements which at least I have known of a lot more than the other movements. And what happened with Me Too India in particular was, what struck me was, I went back to my time as a full-time journalist, and I remember when I was working for the capital newspaper, The Telegraph, for the weekend section, we'd have weekly meetings where we discuss some of the biggest events that have taken place and how do we bring something new or ask new questions of the phenomena that have taken place. How can we bring newer kinds of ideas and analysis into these particular topics, because we didn't want to repeat what was already out there in most other publications, most of the TV channels, etc., etc. So what happened with Me Too India for me immediately was, of course, the real shock of all the revelations, the fact that it was an extremely important moment, in terms of gender relations, in Indian society, and long overdue. But along with that, what happened was I put myself in my, in my journalistic, editor's shoes and tried to see from her or his perspective in terms of what are the questions that are being raised and what are the questions that are being silenced. What are the information gaps that you are here? What's the nature of the information that's coming out? What are its gaps? What are its problems? What are its inconsistencies? What are its contradictions? What are some of its framework issues? How the issue being framed, etc., etc., etc. And that led to me writing at least 5 pieces, 5 different kinds of op-eds in different publications. Now, publishing them has also been a struggle primarily because we hit a point, and this is just a small aside, and then I'll come back to the major points that I'm making. One of the big problems of Me Too India in particular has been the fact that social media set the agenda. Social media set the agenda, which was very important. It was then taken up by the mainstream media, and then the mainstream media went with it to a certain extent till the point it gained some amount of traction, and then the moment many of these things were not being circulated online beyond a point, then even both social media and mainstream media shut shop. Now, so the nature of the conversation we've had over Me Too India has been fairly limited, and it has primarily looked at outing harassers, number one, and number two, to a decent extent, to a very good extent, in fact, bringing out the victims' voices, etc., which is all very important. It was very important that it needed to come out. In return, what we've had, unfortunately, is we've not had a longer and more sustained conversation, which is what has been the subject of many of the pieces I've been writing. Now, what are the points that I've addressed? In one piece, I addressed the fact that we've also got to find ways of engaging with the alleged perpetrator or the alleged harasser or the confirmed harasser, and find out where is this harasser coming from, what's the world, in large cases he is coming from, how is he being socially constructed, what goes inside the making of what we now consider a sexual abuser, and what's the nature of this construction. A fuller engagement with that particular aspect, number one. That one piece dealt with that. The second piece dealt with what I consider, again, and most of the writing has been, as I said, non-academic, deliberately non-academic, because I also wanted to engage with this issue by trying to use words as simply as possible while trying to convey fairly complex ideas. So that meant I also dealt with the whole question of tradition. What do I mean by tradition here? And I'm trying to look at tradition in a very limited way in terms of understanding sex and sexual intimacy. It's my hypothesis for my journalistic purposes that gaining sex or sexual intimacy in societies like India, and when I say India, the larger, wider Indian subcontinent, it's very difficult to gain sexual intimacy without undergoing the rituals of so-called marriage and larger traditions which make intimacy happen. So because of this, it's again my hypothesis that because the individual in these environments is so trapped before he or she or of any other gender, before the individual begins realizing what he or she is, who she is, etc., the whole pressure of tradition has already pushed you into thinking and ideating about sex in certain ways, where there hasn't been much individual agency, apart from, of course, there have been, many marginal instances of assertion, etc. All those things do happen, but to a great extent, there is overwhelming power of so-called tradition when it comes to defining what your sex life is. Big problem. That was the second essay. The third essay looked also at an idea which I thought wasn't being unpacked in the way I thought it should have been, and this is primarily to do with the fact that a number of harassers have been married, a number of harassers have been, in very stereotypical terms, what you call actually happily married with children, this, that, etc., and seem to be leading fairly bourgeois lives with very, with very good careers, etc. So my question then is, what is the role of, if this is the case, then if all this is the case, then there is some problem with the institution of marriage. There's also some problem with the institution of marriage delivering, in a way, a happy sex life. And what are these questions? Why are we getting into a situation where things like these are happening, number one, and number two, the whole idea of the individual being in a way trapped in an environment where he or she feels very sexually frustrated. So one particular aspect, one particular essay dealt with this whole notion of what might be, a working idea of sexual frustration. The fact that the MJ Akbars of the world were not only abusing their powerful positions, but are they sexually frustrated people, is the question that I'm asking. A number of these harassers, and that's also, I think, a question which wasn't being raised, or I thought it wasn't being raised, but I thought it was an important enough question to raise. Again, I don't have any definitive answers. A lot of these essays were really questions that I'm asking, were what I thought were relevant and legitimate and germane questions to be asking of the phenomenon. So essay number 3 looked at the idea of sexual frustration. The fourth essay looked at what I thought was one of the big reasons why Me Too India almost shut shop, not completely, almost shut shop in 3 months' time. So it took off sometime in October, and by January or something, January or middle of January or late January, I found that there was not much action in terms of not outing people, but in terms of having a longer sustained conversation about many of the things that go into understanding sexual harassment, sexual abuse, etc., etc. And this was also a time, again, a small little anecdote here. There were a number of people that I was writing to whom I also think they themselves consider themselves to be feminist liberal editors. And at least on more than one occasion, I found them to write back to me and saying that, Me Too India is out of the news cycle. We are not running pieces like this anymore because it's over, something like that. And I was frankly quite taken aback. This is such a big earth-shattering phenomenon, and you're telling me in 3 months' time that this is over, it's out of the news cycle, we can't take any more pieces on these ideas, etc., etc. Please try and move it elsewhere. And it was a bit of a struggle to get these pieces published. So the fourth idea looked at what happens with the news cycle, and the big difference, the big clincher between Me Too India and a big differentiating factor between Me Too India and Me Too America was the fact that with Me Too America, the New Yorker and the New York Times primarily broke the stories. They sustained the conversation. Not only did they sustain the conversation, you also had a hit back. Me Too America has also had a hit back in terms of Asia Argento and Rose McGowan being questioned over their motives, over what they did, etc., etc. Meaning, what I'm trying to say is that at least in a comparative perspective, there's been a wider mainstream discussion over what has happened in the United States. That has not happened here primarily because social media defined and set the agenda, and unfortunately, social media to a great extent runs on the binary framework. The binary framework meaning you're either with the movement or against the movement, and there's no in-between position. There's no in-between negotiating position for something like a conversation to be sustained over many complex issues. And the fifth piece primarily looked at the binary framework, and the idea that the binary framework was actually limiting and harming the discourse over Me Too India, and we only had a certain set of voices emerging from Me Too India. Again, they're very important voices, but they can't be the only voices. And we've got to have a wider conversation about about 20,000 other things which have emerged from the movement. So that's what I was saying.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ram. That's well within the time frame we should be interested.
Thank you, Pasana, and to Rohini and Alia for organizing this. And the delight of being the closing speaker is that you are condemned to repeat everything that has already been said through the day, and that is the task I want to undertake and perform it well. I think it's de rigueur to say that the matter is a complicated one. That is exactly what every speaker has in their own way pointed out. Another phrase for something that is complicated that I think I want to hold on to is a phrase from the legal scholar Patricia Williams, something that she calls is a profoundly troubling paradox. And the two quotes that I've put on the slide, to me, indicate a certain kind of profoundly troubling paradox connected to be it Me Too or the ways in which we understand and talk about what constitutes sexual harm. Now, what I intend to do in this presentation is take you through some of the things that I returned to reading, some of the things that I spotted on the JGU campus in the wake of #MeToo. I'm not on Facebook, so there wasn't a way to necessarily see what was happening on social media, but there were indications that I could pick up by both returning to a certain set of readings and things that I saw on campus. Okay. This is something that's available on the campus, and it's a regular poster that you're supposed to put out as a matter of mandate, and this has been put out by the SHC. It carries all the contacts of those who are part of the SHC, but there are two interesting things that particularly caught my eye. One, and both are on the kind of right-hand side of the poster. We see 4 words there, and the size of the font increases, right? So it starts with sexual harassment is unfair, unwanted, unacceptable, and unlawful, right? So there's a certain kind of gradation in operation in helping those who are reading the poster see why sexual harassment is something that needs to be prevented. And this is university speak because it's being put out by the SHC. So the law becomes kind of the arbiter that helps us draw. So you shouldn't be a sexual harasser or beware of being a sexual harasser, whatever that might mean. Most importantly because it's unlawful, a little less important because it's unacceptable, unwanted, or unfair. And the 3 words that are right after that, know the line. So the line drawing function seems a task that one undertakes when trying to figure out what qualifies as sexual harassment or sexual harm and what doesn't. But the line drawing function is an interesting metaphor that all of us undertake even when we are not necessarily talking about sexual harm or trying to define sexual harm. So right from the beginning of the conversation that we were having today, one kind of line drawing function that almost all of the speakers were trying to attempt was a line between the legal and the beyond of the legal. So Rukmini's speech opened with trying to go beyond the law. Nivi's, one of her earlier books, was subtitled Beyond the Law. So somehow one was working with the presupposition is the law is limiting. That's the space that's limited, that's finite, and one needs to overcome that finitude in some form or the other. So my sense was, and I put these kind of coupled words together as I was listening to the speakers, and this is the complexity that I think a lot of the speakers are trying to put out. There are these difficult relationships between certitude and finitude, coherence, fragmentation, so certainty, indeterminacy, so on and so forth. But interestingly, while these words share deep intimacies, and I'm borrowing the term on top of the page from the anthropologist Bhrigupati Singh, which I thought captures the relationship between these words very well. They're agonistic as well as intimate. And this agonistic intimacy works in an interesting way. 2 illustrations, and it's unfortunate that for both those illustrations I'll have to refer to Nivi's speech, and she's not here. One is when Nivi at a certain point offered an illustration and said, feminism has won, right? So there's a certain kind of tussle between these extremely intimate words, but somehow we are driven by a desire for one to trump the other. So certitude must overcome finitude, coherence must overcome fragmentation, certainty must overcome indeterminacy, interpretation must overcome undecidability, and authority must overcome vulnerability. And it seems that while it was very clear that the limitation of law was put on the board, in fact it was only Saptarshi and Vikramaditya to a certain extent who also put on the table the idea of the limitation of feminism. So the fact that there was also one point where Nivi said, as feminists, queer feminists, we know the difference between proper and improper forms of discomfort. Feminism, of course, is driven by a will to know, but to presuppose that it already knows is that trumping effect that one possibly struggles with. Okay, what comes next? So I've divided the presentation and what comes through it in 4 parts. The first part is some glimpses of what I think has turned into common sense campus vocabulary. These are inflated terms that have attained a certain kind of currency. And I'm not saying that one needs to not use these terms, but I think there is possibly a need for closer attention to what has led to these terms being used in the way they are used, and these are some of those terms. In the second part of the presentation, I'll venture into a territory that I'm more comfortable with, which is attend to a certain set of theoretical feminist debates. And while I was putting the presentation together, I kept thinking that it's going to be really boring and hopeless because I'll be talking about too much theory. But as an academic, and a decent one at that, I guess, I take on the task of reading seriously, and I think theory for me is one location where I find some solace from hopelessness, or maybe it's an encounter with hopelessness which takes place under less hostile environment than otherwise for me. Okay, and in the closing part of the presentation, I will raise a pointed question about the definition of sexual harassment as it appears in the JGU policy. Okay, so we keep using these words. These words are all around. They somehow have exhausted the need for interpretation. It's where interpretation has been trumped in a certain way. And I want to think about these words in the context of the earlier slide where I pointed out that those three words know the line. So this was a poster that I saw in one of the lifts. This was put up the day, I think, there was a meeting being organized to protest against the High Court judgment in the case of the students from Jindal who were granted bail. And it's an affirmative statement, it's a prohibitory statement, and then there is a minor clarification that gets attached right after it. If you can't see it, it says it is not okay. So it's again a drawing the line function that is being articulated. But that's a poster put up by students. This is another poster put up by students. I think this was put up while a college fest was being organized. Consent is such and such and such, and then lack of consent equals rape, right? Another line drawing function at work. And I'm not saying whether these are right or wrong, but I'm saying that the logic at work is the task of drawing a line. This is again university speak. This is what the SHC has put out. It's the green line that divides look from Lear. Sexual harassment, know where the line is. Right? So it's again appeals to a will to know, to train people about where to draw the line, becomes a pedagogic project that the university, through the form of the SHC, undertakes. And of course, there's a let's talk, so that this doesn't come across as prohibitory or as the voice of command or sanction, but a more cajoling invitation for having conversations. This is another one. The green line replaces, the blue line replaces the green line. I'd be interested to know the people who designed these posters, what work the colors were doing. And I think there's something to be said about the line here, and then return to a presupposition with which this line drawing logic is at work. And it's a big, fat, bold line, right? Okay, now I'm entering the second part of the presentation, which is the more theoretical discussion, or what I might call theoretical discussion. So yes, a complexity is de rigueur, and here's a glimpse into the way in which, for example, feminists have engaged with their own, the complexity surrounding the way to understand sexual harm. So in the last 14 years of my teaching life, I've moved from teaching at a public university, at Pune University, to JGU, which is a private university. And one of the things that I have noticed, and it might be not the same for everyone if someone's moved between two kinds of universities, I've seen discourses on sexual harm oscillate between exclusion and exceptionalism. So earlier, it would require a lot of effort to get the administration to even take gender-related issues, let alone sexual harassment, seriously. Not that they are still doing it, and yet I do notice increasingly that the campus has turned into an extremely sexually aware space. And it's such a sexually aware space where sexual violence in a certain way has emerged as one of the most egregious forms of violation that one can face. So it's this oscillation between exceptionalism and exclusion that the next part hopes to speak to. Okay, we'll go a few years back. And these are some of the readings that I was returning to in the wake of #MeToo. So in 1977, Michel Foucault was reported to have offered an argument in favor of the desexualization of rape in the criminal law's understanding of it. He had asked why rape should be considered no different from a punch in the face, so nothing but that. Why should an assault with a penis be legally different from an assault with any other body part? His provocation was aimed at rethinking the terms on which different kinds of physical harm were calibrated in the criminalization of sexual violence. To desexualize the crime of rape for Foucault was a means of resisting what is referred to as disciplinary power, to contest, and I'm quoting Foucault here, the preponderant place given to sexual organs in moral discourse. Although Foucault's proposition caused major furor among feminists, someone like Sharon Marcus offered alignment through her understanding of what she called the rape script. For Marcus, rape script is the set of gendered cultural narratives that enable the violence of rape by producing women as subjects of shame, fear, and violence, and men as subjects of aggression backed up by physical prowess. Rather than ascribing rape to the terrifying facticity of the penis, and that's the word phrase that Marcus uses, she suggests we should turn our attention to the cultural scripts that write women's bodies as penetrable or violable and challenge those instead. Important provocation?
5 minutes.
Okay. The radical feminist response to Foucault, coming from a Catherine McKinnon-like position, was to ask the question, that's an important radical feminist response to an argument of this nature, if it's not about sex, why didn't he just punch her in the face? Now, this presents a certain kind of agonistic intimacy. The agonistic relationship here between these rival positions is about the disagreement regarding whether sexual harm is exceptional in nature from other kinds of physical harm. However, the intimacy between these two positions is that both remain deeply suspicious of law's role in countering sexual harm. These arguments are dialectically organized when it comes to their understanding of sex, but joined in friendship in their response to law. And we see, I can think of 3 more recent instances where this agonistic intimacy gets played out. So I'm not going to detail these, but there's been a return to the kind of sex-positive feminism versus radical feminist debate in the context of a law against sexual harassment at American universities called Title IX. And the debate has played out between McKinnon and Janet Haley, who at one point provocatively said that she wants to take a break from feminism, and she's, I think, been on a break since the time that she took that break. Interestingly here, while McKinnon and Haley are oppositionally positioned, they also share a certain kind of suspicion of the law itself. So we see that there are opposing feminist positions joined together again with regard to the suspicion of law. Of course, I mean, this is a debate that played out in India recently, those who get referred to as the list feminists versus the due process feminists. Again, while the debate has been portrayed as one of opposing points of views, I think they're also joined together in a certain way. So if the list feminists, whoever they are, were disclaiming due process, they were doing so on the basis of an understanding where due process is a certain kind of formalist requirement that should be in place for the effective functioning of the ICCs. Now, the due process feminists who pointed out that that is not the case disagreed with the list feminists by saying that due process is far more wider, a more capacious idea than the formalism. So in a certain sense, both again were demanding a beyond the law position. One, because of the failure of the law, that I don't want to remain, I don't want to continue to have faith in the process. The other saying, yes, the laws failed, but the idea is not just restricted to the way in which the law helps us understand due process. And then there's this ongoing debate, of course, and I'll end with this, is the debate between Nivedita Menon and Koteshwaran. Interestingly, the debate it echoes an earlier debate between Janet Haley, and to me, it echoes an earlier debate between Janet Haley and Brenda Cosgrove. So Koteshwaran's argument, drawing on Haley, is that feminist engagements with law in India have entered a certain kind of realm where it performs some kind of governance role, right? So it becomes a regulatory ideology rather than a liberating ideology. Haley goes to the extent of saying that feminists have blood on their hands, and that's hyperbolic, but I think that she's trying to put something in there. And on the other hand, Nivedita Menon faults Koteshwaran's analysis of feminist engagements with law reform in India by pointing out that so law reform in India is not the outcome merely of feminist engagements. Feminists raise demand, but there are a whole range of other actors that come in to play a role. So you can't hold feminism responsible for the kind of outcomes that we have seen. The echo between the Koteshwaran-Menon debate that I see with regard to Haley and Cosman is that for Koteshwaran, she is offering a containment argument, which is that feminism has its limits. And it's important for us to recognize those limits, because once those limits are crossed, feminism, for example, becomes indistinguishable from other forms of governance regulatory mechanisms. Whereas for Menon, it's a preservation project, meaning she wants to hold on to feminism as a realm that offers her the tools and arguments to be able to point at what's possibly problematic about certain kinds of feminism. Here again, I think both are joined together by a certain kind of suspicion of the law. So what I'm saying is that the way in which we generally think about the debates around sexual harm, we end up in some strange way organizing our arguments on the basis of oppositional positions. My sense is that there are actually far more similarities between the oppositions than differences. I'll end there, and I'll keep the question about the definition for the organizers later.
All right, thank you, Oishik, and thank you very much for keeping in the time. So the format of the panel is such that the panelists will speak and then there is an open discussion. I want to start with the open discussion first, and then perhaps we can come together and make sense of the conversation that has happened in terms of three panelists. Quickly, and this is not a question or a comment, but just to put things in perspective. I believe that we started with Vaishnavi with a very, very important question as to, will a legal response suffice, if I understood you correctly, and I think something that Vishik is also talking about in terms of this troublingly, profoundly troubling paradox that you positioned your conversation in, and also raised significant questions about what are the limits of feminism in the context of this entire question about sexual harassment. Who is the sexual harasser, and how do we understand the context in which sexual harassment happens? And of course, the most important question is about what kind of legal response, and something that the panel sought to talk about in its framework that we are talking about. Largely, if you talk in terms of the ICC and other kinds of redressal mechanisms within the kind of settings that we currently exist in. Who are the ICC? Who are the people who make up the ICC? What does it mean for a person to approach a body like the ICC, who sometimes may be composed of people who are antithetical to the entire discourse that is happening around the question of sexual harassment at the workplace. So these are very significant questions that have been raised. Let us open up the discussion, and perhaps based on a couple of questions that we get, we can take the discussions further. Can we take 3 questions at a time, please? And then perhaps the panelists can respond and we can take it forward again.
I had a question for Rahul. I did read your and I was wondering why and something that you mentioned here as well, your hypothesis being that sexual abuse results from some form of sexual dissatisfaction. And I think in the 70s and 80s, feminists encountered this problem and responded by saying that it's not a problem of sex, it's a problem of how. It's a question of how. It's not a question of design. Trying to understand why and in a sense you are questioning that insight. If you could say a little about that. I mean, what do you find inadequate about your explanation of that?
Can we take a couple of questions more, and then yes, please. I'll just come to you in a second. Yes, sure.
I don't know if I'll be audible. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
My question is sort of to the last panel and this panel as well, and I am trying to understand where accountability lies of the individual now that we are trying to problematize these ideas so much. So whether it is in Rahul's conversations about sexual frustration or in conversations that we were having within the last panel as well, if we are going to create overarching goals within the ICC and create a system wherein we are trying to understand, which is a very legitimate goal, trying to understand the systems which are creating the sexual harasser, for instance, and what are the problems that have led to the creation of this person, whether it is the overused terms on campus of hypermasculinity, or it is sexual frustration, or is it the system itself which does not allow for a traditional form of marriage, which allows only for a traditional form of marriage to allow as a space of sexual intimacy, etc. So in this conversation, as I was trying to ask a partly related question, the last one as well, are we somehow losing individual accountability for the accused? And does that not then create the opposite of what the ICCs initially were supposed to do? Of course, we have therapy sessions outside of that which can allow for catharsis in addition to what you were saying. And of course, the ICC can fulfill dual roles, but would that then result in a lack of accountability? So all of your thoughts on that.
One question to Rahul, because I also wanted to ask you about the relationship between sexual frustration and sexual harassment, and I wanted to know also I wanted to know the evidence of this link. Like, it's not simply a discursive link, because you are making a rather seemingly evidentiary link. But I was also interested. I also wanted to inquire about the voyeurism of a certain kind of journalism around Me Too. And your first and your article around the construction of the harasser suffers from it, precisely because the only time I hear that the psyche of a perpetrator is actually analyzed by non-interested media and non-feminist media is when it's a sexual crime. Only rapists and sexual harassers are given these kind of complicated, and sexual abusers are given these complicated sexual psyches, whereas we have no such analysis of rioters, no such analysis of other kinds of mobs, no such analysis of fathers at all who beat their children, nothing of that. But there is such a kind of voyeurism with the psyche of the sexual. And I was wondering, where does that come from, and why is it so exceptional? And therefore, kind of drawing from Wojciech's thing, what is so exceptional about the sexual? And what are your own checks around your own voyeurism? There was a voyeurism of the Me Too, I realized, of putting all these testimonies out, and lots of men relished these testimonies. But there was a voyeurism in all this kind of critical writing around Me Too also. To Wojciech, I wanted to know, I wanted to kind of think about, let's just think about Foucault only. I'm very, it's like, that's a particularly like famous quote, and there's like, we could go on and on about how people have read it, but I'm interested in this double movement in Foucault as well, which is the degenitalization of sexuality, but also the going back to the care of the self as drawing from sexual relationships, right? So the ability to respond to the confessional, the disciplinary sexuality also has a sexual relationship, which then transforms into the care of the self. So it's not as if Foucault completely departs from the erotic one's sexuality, but the other time the sexual in very easy ways. So even as he degenitalizes, we know that the care of the self is built on a penetrative relationship after all. So he's not really letting go of that. I want to say this especially because of Foucault's own obsession with his own sex life, which we know through like the Saint Foucault and other kinds of gay hagiographies of Foucault, which is that he was a very sexual person himself. He was constantly in bathhouses. He was part of fetish communities, etc. He applauded the fetish communities for coming up with a homosexual way of life. He thought the homosexual way of life was a particularly interesting thing to have in the world. So then, what is with Foucault? What is with Foucault that he can kind of analyze everyone else's sexuality but doesn't analyze his own, and thinks that is a kind of space that's off it, and also thinking about a kind of public discourse around sexuality and a private sexualness there.
Thank you. Can we end with Danish for this round, and then we'll take one more round?
Yeah, sorry. So I apologize if this question is a bit adjacent to the conversation, but I'm just struggling with this question of you, so I'll put it out there. So we're talking about creating safe spaces that came up in your presentation, and how certain people should or shouldn't speak to facilitate making this a safe space. And then you give a trigger warning, right? Now, when I give a trigger warning, I think the assumption is that a person is triggered because they've experienced a certain kind of possible violation of certain trauma in the past, and so therefore I'm trying to safeguard that from happening, right? But you give the warning, and then you tell the person in the room that if they are triggered, then they may leave the room. So at that point, they are going to make a physical movement out of the room, and thereby identifying themselves to the room at large as possible survivors of trauma. So I'm grappling with this, right? So how are we then making this a safe space by employing that trigger warning? If you can just help me understand. Yeah, thanks.
I request the panelists to respond and then we'll take questions. Oh, next one. Yes, please.
Yeah, thanks for your questions over that particular aspect of sexual frustration. Now, when I wrote that particular piece, I got a lot of flack for making that point. And it's also because, again, the unfortunate thing with journalistic writing is you're short on space, etc., etc. There are many other things, and the subject is so complicated, so it's very difficult to make any argument in 800,000 words beyond the point. So, very quick answer to all of you is, one of the things that I try to raise in that particular piece is about while it is absolutely given that there is abuse of power, and it is 1000% a manifestation of the abuse of power, yes. But there's also, it doesn't, for me, explain the whole phenomenon completely, and that's the question that I'm trying to raise. And MJ Akbar abused power, yes, I get it. But is power abuse, is it the only category to understand him? Where did he reach that point where he began abusing power? That's my larger, bigger, grander question. And for me, unfortunately, at the moment, the explanation that it is, that this is a whole game about power is very, very important, but it's also limiting, because it seems to me much more the symptom than the cause. And I'm looking for deeper reasons as to how did the abuser become who in this case he is, and where does that whole journey process come from? Number one. The second thing that I'd also say is when it came to Me Too America, there were some amount of questions which both Ronan Farrow and I forget the other journalists were trying to look at how Weinstein, not only what he did, but also possibly how he became who he is. And I think those questions are very important. That's why this question came up. And it might have been very controversial, or maybe unfortunate, or maybe it was my mistake that I used this term, but I couldn't find at that particular point of time any other any other idea which could, in a way, move me away from understanding sexual abuse as only a form of sexual power abuse. Yeah, go ahead.
You're still not telling us as to what led to the hypothesis. I mean, what was the basis of the hunch?
Okay, fine. Yeah.
Basically, what Vikram said, that you're also making evidentiary claim.
Fine, fair enough.
Right, so
again, as I said again, it was in a way, yes, it was a leap that I was making, and a leap that I was making on the basis of the hunch that what are the kinds of narratives, what are the types of narratives that these individuals might have had as they are growing up and becoming sexualized. And if it is a certain kind of a society where I feel, the sex comes to you in a certain fashion, mediated through tradition, mediated through marriage, etc., then there will be a set of problems. And also to tell you just some other things, just a bit. I don't have it right now with me, but the studies of the National Family NHFI have also been trying to indicate many of the things that have been happening with notions of sexual frustration. So that is what it is. A further essay is in the pipeline. There will be more on this. But thank you so much for this episode.
All right.
I'll keep this short because this isn't about food, so I'm in. But so the two sources that I think that tell me where Foucault said or wrote this, the first one was at a public seminar on prison abolition. And so he was reported to have said this, and there were other feminists there as well, and that's where kind of. And the other was, I think, he was asked a question about this in an interview, so he repeated himself in that context. My sense, I mean, this is not a response to your question directly, my sense is that the argument or provocation was advanced particularly in the context of the prison abolition movement, in the way in which over-criminalization of different kinds or punitive power in the hands of the state makes the state stronger. That's one context. But I don't necessarily read this as a call for liberation of any kind from, so your performance of liberation from governmental power can be seen and recognized only in the public, but you're trapped in the private, and there is no escape from the private. And I'm guessing in a certain way, I can't remember where he said this, but used an expression like what he called the indefiniteness of the struggle, is that one liberation will automatically make you confront another kind of regulation. And so I wasn't necessarily reading that as a call for liberating yourself from the regulatory grip of the law.
Thanks for bringing that up. Until you mentioned it, I didn't really realize the possibility of how that would be outing people with the same triggers. And yeah, that definitely happened in short sight, and I'm really sorry about that. But since you mentioned it, in this 1 minute since you mentioned it, I've been trying to think of how and if we can have conversations around sexual abuse and harassment without triggering victims and survivors or people who do get triggered by these mentions. In my presentation, I did try to make the language as less triggering as possible, but obviously it wasn't 100% possible given the things I was talking about. And yeah, I think I'm still thinking about if there is a way I could have given the trigger warning without asking people to leave, or just said, yeah, these are the things I'm going to talk about, so if you're triggered. I don't know how I could have completed that sentence. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure if anyone here has any suggestions or we could discuss further on this, then.
Can I just offer one more? So I don't even know if it's about how you give the trigger warning effectively, because I also think that really the nature of triggers and the way that they're buried in the subconscious means that that direct word or none of that presentation will be a trigger, but the taste of hot tea or someone's casual hug could be as much of a trigger. So it's, I don't know, I think like there's a different conversation to be had on what triggers really are than this. And that's just that's what I know.
Just a quick 2 sets of connected responses and thoughts. There's obviously been a lot of debate around trigger warning, particularly in teaching courses. And certain universities require you to put in this trigger warning in your course manuals. And there have been instances where students have actually taken faculty members or complained against them because course manuals didn't have trigger warning. So one of the debates that remains quite contentious is that one, do the need for offering trigger warnings in a certain way perform a sensorial task? I mean, can it be read as a form of censorship when it comes to talking about matters related to sex, sexuality and sexual harm? One is that. The other is, in taking on the responsibility to articulate a trigger warning, could that be in a certain sense an absolution? I've unburdened myself of, I'm the good, sensitive speaker, teacher, whatever else. And the third is a slightly larger, I've completely forgotten what it is. But I'll come back to it.
Just to kind of add to that, at the university where I used to teach, there is no formal system of getting feedback on courses. It's a public university, etc. And all of us who are not permanent teachers don't get contracts the next year. But one of the things that kind of stayed with me in one of the courses was that I was teaching. I was brought in as a guest lecturer to teach a course that someone had just left. So the course was in my hands and all of these kinds of things, and I had to just come and do a course that I was asked to teach. Right? I could have exercise control, but you brought under certain kind of precarious conditions, blah blah. But at the end of that 2-credit course, the students, we have this habit of just passing sheets of paper if someone wants to write anything. Often it's just like you were too strict. But one of the things that has stayed with me is that in one of the notes it was written that there was an eerie silence on the question of caste in the class. And they said that they're going to, I mean, they wrote a kind of long thing, but they said that they're going to actually have to reevaluate doing gender studies precisely because the silence was so terrifying. And they didn't feel, of course, capable of raising the issue as a Dalit person. But they also just, the fact that it doesn't even have to be another two. The fact that the silence in some sense can be so condemning of what is a safe space, because here you are trying to build a course around rubbish, some feminist research methods, but a course in which people have found themselves erased in a far more damning way than actually a conversation would have. So I also quite struggle with where does the agency of the trigger, of course, lie. What kind of psychic this thing would be required, but I also feel like what are our classrooms and where we have spaces why are they making people so lonely? And what are people missing in terms of that? Because the fact that you enter a university so vulnerably now that I just have to say this, and I might come off as slightly cocky, but there is a new threshold of vulnerability in students in the last couple of years. And maybe you people are far more attuned than the rest of us, you people are far more in touch, maybe there's more discourse and conversation about it, whatever it is. But there is more vulnerability in our universities now. Even as the university administratively is also being made more vulnerable by policy and by these kinds of people. So I don't know how to deal with that very real vulnerability, which is kind of systemic. The absence of conversations of caste in a classroom in gender, the loneliness of students without student unions and political processes, and the fact that teachers are now employed at these places to do these kind of bureaucratic things and then thrown out, and then the administration is only interested in the annual report. So I'm just kind of, it's not to you, but I'm just kind of thinking about it.
I just remember that little. This is not a question, because I think all of us at different times have faced this moment. So you articulated it to your money and you said anyone, and there was silence, and you said I'm going to read that as a yes. And what does that say about the way in which we think about the absence of affirmative consent in the context of what qualifies as a sexual harm? The absence of affirmation being read as,
I actually wanted to say something around this entire idea of reading the silences, but as the moderator, and a decent one is that, I will keep my thoughts to myself and take the second round of questions. Aldina wanted to say something, and then
questions, one question. Actually, you started your presentation by saying that I don't know why I'm here, but then you have a guess, and that guess was that two guesses. One that people follow you on Instagram. The second guess, which is very important, that ultimately the persistence in raising an issue institutionally and holding the institutional ICC to account in the public domain relentlessly, banging your head against the wall and getting the wall to break or move or give way. The fact that two people had disciplinary action taken against them and it's a successful struggle of sorts that the director has changed. So activism and that kind of agency is so important. And yet in your talks, as you said, that's why we don't complain. But your actions speak about activism, really making the world give way and change. So I just wanted to ask finish it very quickly. Jermaine Gray in the recent debate over Me Too sort of raised the same issue about trade being banal, that it should not be seen as. So there is a very recent conversation about it too. So it's interesting that for you the recent discussions have triggered theoretical anti-Semites, and for me they triggered movement anti-Semites about debates that are happening on the ground. And yet, is there a theoretical reason why you didn't do it? And secondly, I like the gesture that you make, which is that in the structuralist binaries, you made the post-structuralist point. The binaries are perhaps not so binary after all, and the gesture is perhaps that there's a better conversation that the binaries and extremes in the debate are not so mutually exclusive and not so oppositional. And yet the invocation of post-structuralism and Foucault, for me, is that ultimately there is a positionality there, which is that certainty, finding any definitive, is a problem. So bulk of the theoretical enterprise is about the journey of theory, not about reaching anywhere decisively. As I submit, there's power everywhere, so we don't know what to fight anymore, because everything is power. So I'm asking you, is there any merit in sexual violence? What happened to the debate? They proposed a law which sort of, on the rape law, they said let's just at least sort of remove the exceptionality of rape and sexual assault. So let's have a law about sexual assault rather than rape and other forms. So that was a big debate, and sort of everybody took a position in that. But within at least sexual violence and sexual assault can really rape not the exception to it. So I'm just asking that is there any theoretically any reason to find certainty of any right?
If I may provoke the last two panels a bit, these are questions I have, these are, of course I don't know answers to them. This is open to panelists from the last panel and this one as well. A lot of the conversation in the last panel was around sexual hurt and the ICC being able to accommodate the anger and therefore act as this mechanism of catharsis. And you posed a question is redressal a recourse? To which I would like to ask, what are we institutionalizing then? Because I think this is a question we need to at least think about. You made a comment about how can in what ways can the sexual present itself to the law? If I might just rephrase that a bit and add an inflection elsewhere. Can the sexual present itself to the law when the law's preoccupation is constantly with sexual security? And the third one is a derivative of what Rahul said, and again I open this question to everybody. How does one engage with the perpetrator or a supposed perpetrator? What are the metrics of their engagement, since clearly we're talking about this in a climate of anger, alliance and appropriation?
I can just make one very, very quick point. In fact, and this came up when Vaishnavi was doing her presentation. She had the photographs of two people, I think Rajiv Sawant and the India Today journalist, right? The India Today journalist who was accused of sexual harassment, Gaurav Sawant, and someone else, I forget who. Okay, fine. So you had two pictures of two people who've been accused of sexual harassment, and my mind also went back to the fact that, again, it's a question really about framing that I'm saying, because you've also had one person who's very famous in the Bombay public relations industry with Bollywood called Anirban Das Blah, very, very big person who was accused of sex crimes, who tried committing suicide after he was outed. Number one, I'm not saying this to free them of blame. I'm just saying that this is the nature of the conversation that we're having over who the harasser is. You might have people who are accused and who seemingly have gotten away with it, but you also had cases of people who in some form or the other are also still grappling with the consequences of what they've done. which again brings me back to the question about who the harasser is and what is, in this case, his journey like, and what's the current condition and what's going to happen later. So it's a continuing journey, and I think that's an important journalistic, maybe even sociological question.
Yes, and then. Okay, I will just speak.
Yeah. So my question is to Professor Rahul Jairam. I mean, you have spoken about the Me Too movement. You have made a point that said that it has started in October and it has ended in January, or the media has not reported. My question is, what is the role of media in it? Let's just say that, okay, the Me Too movement was at its peak in October, and there were very few cases reported in January. But couldn't the media have followed up on that one? In the same way the media has not followed up on the Nirbhaya gang rape case. So that is the question.
Yeah, okay,
Question,
fine.
Rahul, and then yes.
Yeah, so I just want to go back to the point that Mr. Jairam made with respect to how we should look at the actual characterization of the harasser, as in how they reach that point of being a harasser. So I think that if we were to analyze the social conditions surrounding, let's say, the proliferation of sexuality in India compared to the proliferation of sexuality, let's say, in a country like the United States, it's vastly different, wherein the entire culture surrounding sex is a lot more open in the US and it's a lot more closed in India. Despite that, it seems to me that the tendency is that the relationship of power is what is creating situations of the actual harassment to happen. So, for example, Harvey Weinstein or R. Kelly or any person that you name in the Me Too movement in the United States is implicated largely because they abuse their position of power in a similar manner to how the MJ Akbar example exists in India. So, how would you characterize those social conditions in the US compared with India in terms of the amount of contribution it makes? Because it seems to me that largely the structures of power are what are ultimately resulting in a situation of sexual harassment compared with studying those social conditions. Of course, I wouldn't deny that the social conditions play some amount of role, but it's not that the lack of that proliferation of sex is leading to a better situation in another country.
Alright, can we now take answers?
Yes, I will just do very quick responses to both the questions that were posed to me. Number one, why did the media in India, for example, why did the media not continue with its, with asking questions and doing the follow-up? Now, and this is the classic Indian media problem. I'm in complete agreement with the question that was asked, and this is the point that I was also making. One, because we had Me Too India to a great extent being set by Twitter and being set by social media, which runs on a certain kind of binary framing. That binary framing was to a good extent replicated in the mainstream press and on television. But the binary framing can only get you up to a certain point, and the problem with that framing is that it's not going to pose and ask complex questions of the phenomenon at hand. And those complex questions also tend to be, complexity tends to be, it is not, tends to be boring, tends to be non-dramatic, tends to be, now what editor who's looking for TRPs and eyeballs and attention is going to, in a very sustained manner, continue asking questions about the making of the harasser, So that is one problem, one inbuilt problem with the Indian media. By contrast, in the United States, for example, I was just bringing the United States in here from a very strictly journalistic perspective. I just saw that publications like the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Atlantic there is now so much on Harvey Weinstein, and so much of it is which is also fairly layered. And this is the job of the journalist, this is the job of the publication. Good journalism is boring. In a way, it is very, very boring, and but if it's socially relevant, those questions have to be sustained, and journalism prospers only in an ecosystem where that kind of questioning is allowed. The reporters are given time. It took months and months and months of work for the exposés of Weinstein to come out. That was one. I was actually not comparing conditions in the United States and India in terms of gaining sexual intimacy, etc. I was not drawing that at all. I was only looking at how the media behaved there and why it behaved the way it did and what the media did here.
Can I just ask a short? Yeah, so I think one of the highlighted issues that I had with your point is that in terms of pure statistics, like the US has the highest number of reported cases of sexual assaults from any country in the world. And this is despite the fact that sexuality is a lot more open, right? So, beyond just the journalistic sense, from a very purely theoretical point of view, how could you justify the social conditions of creating a harasser as being so very important compared with the structure of power itself? That was my question.
Okay.
I understand that your own point isn't to draw a parallel between the countries, but to look at the journalistic perspective. But I think that at a very theoretical level, that journalistic perspective may be negated by this.
Fair enough. Very nicely framed. Thank you so much for that point. And it also hits upon and touches upon what Vikram and Saptarshi were saying earlier, which is my claim over the fact that the sexual harasser also comes from a position I feel of in India being a person who's emerging from an environment of sexual frustration. What the sexual frustration means, in a way. Is that what you?
I mean, I presume that is your point.
Okay, that's my claim. And the claim, as I said, is there have been studies by the National Public Health Foundation of India which have looked at things like how sex is narrativized and how what the kind of sexual narratives people are getting in different social contexts in India, etc., and trying to establish whether something like sexual frustration exists as a social reality and how this is defined, etc. Again, it leads us into a different kettle of fish altogether, which I will be digging into deeply very soon.
So if I understood you right, okay, I'm just did you mean why I said I don't understand why I'm here that I'm done when I'm actually really calling this is the basic concern? Is that what you meant by that? Why about that? Like why
I think activism is so inspiring, especially when it succeeds in doing something which seems insurmountable. Would you advocate that to others? That others should also try to do that it is possible. That yes, it takes a toll on you, it takes an effort, but it's possible to make the walls give way. So would you advocate that, or would you say it's okay?
Oh, I mean, definitely advocate activism because that's all I've done. And
yes.
And were you asking me a question when you said just a general? Okay.
Just pointing out the region.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very quickly to Albina's question, thank you. I mean, so the question in a certain sense was, does certitude carry any value for me? Okay, not any more value than uncertainty, for example. And I say that even if you were reading me to have made a post-structural gesture, in that gesture I'm not able to let go of radical feminism. And it's interesting, right, for various reasons. So this is not just about McKinnon, but Greer included are referred to by this acronym called TERF, exclusionary radical feminists. But last year, a trans scholar, I think she's an art theorist called Andrea Long Chu, in fact wrote a piece praising radical feminism. So I'm saying that it's, for me, I'm unable to see how to let go of one completely and hold on to the other. Do I see some value in so I'm certain that, say, a university space or a workspace needs to have an ICC, right? But I'm uncertain that there are posters like the posters that I put up.
Sexting is sexual harassment?
But I'm uncertain about the certainty with which the blue and green lines are being drawn. I'm uncertain about the certainty with which the categorization of unfair becomes far, far smaller than it being unlawful. So again, I mean, yeah. But I've never sat on an ICC, so I think the yeah. So I might have a different take on certainty.
All right. With that, we have come to the end of this session. Thank you very much for all your patience, for engaging with the panel. There is one final thing I want to say, and I'm still formulating this thought in my head, so please bear with me. And I do not claim to speak on behalf of the organizers, but this was mentioned and I do not believe it should be left hanging in the air. There is an ICC, there is a sexual harassment committee where cases are taken up. However, and I'm speaking only on behalf of myself here, is that particularly in a setting like a university setting, often the experiences of sexual harassment can be very, very isolating experience. To talk and discuss about it in the context of a conference like this is one thing, but the experience that one undergoes also could be a very, very isolating experience. A faculty colleague's name was mentioned in Vaishnavi's presentation, and I believe that, and again I'm reiterating that I'm not speaking on behalf of the organizers. The conference program and schedule has been out for a while, so everybody knew, I'm hoping, who are coming to speak, and perhaps there was a hesitation on behalf of some people to come and speak to the organizers about it. So I believe that perhaps we need to continue to work towards creating the safe spaces where people feel confident to come to us and speak. Our responsibility does not end perhaps, and here I speak on behalf of everyone, in engaging at an academic level or at a project level, but we need to perhaps open up these conversations and make it possible for our students to come and speak to us freely. And I do encourage all students who are present here to speak to the faculty members that you know are engaged with the Sexual Harassment Committee. There are redressals available, but these are often isolating experiences. Often we do not know, and it is not possible for everyone to know about everybody. And so I want you to understand that, and I want you to keep that in mind, and I want you to have the confidence, perhaps, to take up these issues through some of the channels, and we as faculty and as part of the administration or part of the Sexual Harassment Committee and others, we have to strive to make sure that that confidence is there amongst our students to take up these issues. Yeah, thank you. We will end this session now.